Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our lecture this evening. Before we jump into that, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I'm thankful that we can gather today to celebrate the legacy of A. Craig Baird, who joined the University of Iowa faculty about 100 years ago and has left numerous marks in shaping the fields of communication studies and the University of Iowa's debate team, which is the A. Craig Baird Debate Forum. Second, I want to thank Communication Studies for helping us host Dr. Christian Lundberg during the time that he's been visiting Iowa City this week. Third, I want to thank Dr. Tanya Uden-Holman and the University of College and our wonderfully supportive alumni who make it possible for us to create programming like this. And then finally, I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening as we sit and reflect on how debate helps us to think about public discourse. And to introduce our lecturer, I am pleased to invite Dr. Kimbrew McLeod, who is the A. Craig Baird Professor of Communication and the Chair of the Communication Studies Department.
Hello. Make sure I'm getting in the frame. I feel like it could be in a Beastie Boys documentary or video. Yes. So, yes, as Tyler Snelling just said, I'm the department chair of Comm Studies here at the University of Iowa, and I hold the A. Craig Baird Professor of Communication Studies for the past 2 years. After being honored with this named professorship, I dug into many of Professor Baird's writings, and one that stood out to me was a 1938 article in Quarterly Journal of Speech titled "The Educational Philosophy of the Teacher of Speech." In it, he wrote a sentence that deeply resonated with me as a teacher and as the chair of Comm Studies. Quote, "The development of skills, habits, ideas, knowledge, attitudes are not, we agree, the end. Rather, they are the means to assimilate each learner into the local and universal community." End quote. I've embraced that idea by trying to find ways to have my own work reach beyond the confines of academia and university life, for instance, by writing for popular media outlets or producing documentaries. And Dr. Lundberg, here to my left, also reaches beyond academic institutions by applying debate methodologies in his consulting work and political outreach, working to bridge partisan divides at the local, national, and international levels. Somewhat echoing what Professor Baird stated. Dr. Lundberg is an associate professor and vice provost for communication at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he's a founding faculty member in the School of Civic Life and Leadership, and a former fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. His work focuses on the role of speech and listening in civic life and leadership, and he is a passionate advocate for revitalizing democratic discourse. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lundberg to the University of Iowa. Thank you.
Thank you. I am really excited to be here. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for everyone here today. I have to say, this is a ratio of totally awesome people to a room. This is the greatest group of folks I could imagine talking to. I mean, so many awesome people in the audience. So really excited to be here. And it is awesome to celebrate 100 years of A. Craig Baird debate at Iowa and the role of his work and his legacy. And it's represented by all the people that are here tonight. I mean, he played such a central role in the founding of the field of communication and the debate team, in theorizing public speaking and how we think about debate. And I think even for the foundations of and our kind of future hope for America. So, like every person in the room is bound up in this link in a chain, the universal to the local, that goes back to Dr. Baird, and for reasons that go well beyond the fact that this is a lecture in his name. Dr. Baird was awesome and did awesome things for Iowa. Great scholar, one of the founders of our field, like 40 books. 2 was hard for me. one of the most recognizable national leaders on analyzing public discourses and the importance of speech for public life. And, one of the things that I love about his work, it was so cool in the kind of scholarly work that he did, is at a time where the university was intensely siloed. He was this like ambitious thinker that thought across different disciplines, logic, psychology, philosophy, and put them all together and would go anywhere to find insights for how essentially we could speak a better America and speak a better world. And he loved teaching. He loved students. His students loved him. So 60 years in total teaching Bates, Columbia, and then 45 right here in Iowa. 150 theses and dissertations. But that was enough for him. Like during the summers, he'd teach high school students and other students at other schools, workshops, debate, etc. So, I mean, it's not a surprise to know that one of his greatest loves was debate. And he was real good at it and made Iowa great at it. He helped shape the identity of this university in completely profound ways. And I don't know, it's awesome to be at a school where you have a team of folks who not only beat the Harvards and Dartmouths and Northwesterns of the world, but that wins national championships. So a little shout out here. If you're online or you're not familiar with debate, I want you to think about college basketball or football. So I'm a UNC prof. We have to like basketball by mandate. We don't like it by Belichick. And imagine a world in which schools accumulated so much talent that they would field multiple teams at the NCAA tournament. Like I would have an Iowa Black and an Iowa Gold. And imagine in that world, some school became so good at it that they had 3 teams in the top 20 rankings going into the tournament, 4 teams in the big dance, and 3 teams going deep into the bracket. So that's awesome. Congratulations to you all, and great work by the coaching staff and team. And of course, that's an extension of and a manifestation of Dr. Baird's legacy in the profoundest of ways. I also wanted, the people that I know that are associated with the team are awesome too. So I'm so thankful for my friend Paul Bellis, who's one of the smartest, savviest administrators and strategists that I know, for head coach Tyler Snelling, who's rapidly becoming a friend and does brilliant scholarly stuff, for Paul Slappy, who is not here with us but is in spirit. And then I have to say, the only thing that might make me a little more leery than doing a lecture where my wife and dad are watching is the fact that Dr. David Hinksman is in the crowd, who is a person who was so important to my debate career and honestly taught me most of the things I know about debate. So thank you. Yeah, well. So, but the thing is, Dr. Baird loved debate for more than just, I don't know, the spectacle of verbal pugilism. He thought it was a technique for helping people do things like consider both sides, and really all the sides that they could. And actually, he thought, which I think is awesome, that the most important debating was what happened in your head before you actually entered a room with an opponent. He emphasized that great debate, not only in principle, but in practice, starts with hard work, curiosity, seeing the limits of your own starting perspective. And so like he made Hawkeye debate a thing in the university, but in the state too. He made it a thing for high school students that came here and went to camp, provided infrastructure and support for debate across the state of Iowa. I mean, how brilliant that there was a debate circuit that was meaningfully supported by the university. And gosh, that'd be great if it happened at other places. He made it a thing for the graduate students that would go out and become professors and teach in communication studies. He even really worked hard to make it a thing for the public. Like they had this radio show on WSUI, which would become eventually the local NPR, that featured debates with the movers and shakers of the day. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he took it global and started to create opportunities for debate exchange around the world and beat those kids at Oxford. So, but he did it because he was grounded in this conviction that teaching people everywhere to be more curious, to be more generous, to be better listeners, and to be better arguers. And he did that because he was driven by these convictions that I find to be so admirable and that we don't talk enough about. The conviction that we should be driven not just by self-certainty or nor overtaken by apathy, but that there was a commitment to truth that subtended a commitment to debate. And like the idea that you could find truth and that you would find it by being every bit as committed to listening as you would be to talking and saying the thing that you wanted to say, and a commitment to the idea that truly great debate and truly great debaters have this kind of beautiful pairing of rigor and empathy where, I don't know, they see that what matters to them and what makes sense to them is not the same as what matters and makes sense to other people. And that the point of the practice of debate was to figure out exactly how you might persuade someone, not simply by coercion or by compelling them, but instead by translating things to them, by articulating things in a way that made sense to other people's foundational commitments and values. And ultimately, he believed that debate was not a contest as much as it was this like beautiful intertwining of discussion and debate and contest and conversation that were bound up together and that were united by a common principle and purpose. And so he believed in the end that the winner in a good debate was not a team, but the truth. That the winner in a good debate was this kind of common conviction that bound us together to know things together. And I believe in reading his work that he was like completely prescient in seeing the future of life in America turned on realizing and practicing those truths. So the brilliance of Baird on that is incredible. So I'm going to talk about debate a little bit. To understand what a big deal Dr. Baird is, you have to understand what a big deal debate is. And by that, I mean not only the competitive intercollegiate activity, but like all the ways that debate is manifest in day-to-day life, whether you're resolving a customer service dispute or determining the direction of your community, or like most of us, dealing with rowdy relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. So talk about debate in that larger sense. And because there's so many good public speaking people in the room, I'm going to signpost or lay out where I'm going to go. Right, I've got a great three-part trick. It's good for me, it's good for you, and it's good for us. Okay, good for me. So I don't want to talk about myself too long. You heard about me in the introduction, a bunch of really fancy things. I should also share I'm a pastor at a church that my wife and I planted, and I do a bunch of political consulting work. So, you know, I mean, like I got to coach and spar with Boris Johnson for the Vote Leave campaign and the Brexit, and I know who played Donald Trump in debate prep for at least one presidential campaign. This guy. No, just kidding. Maybe. But ultimately, like I'm a Utah debate kid. And it may come as a surprise to you, but not to folks in my family who know me. And Dad, this is for you. I was an annoying elementary school kid. I was loudmouth, and I was always smart enough to think up a good jab at the other kids who were more athletic than me, but not quite smart enough to keep that in my mouth and not say it. I was probably pretty obnoxious, and unlike my current status as a paragon of style and charm, I was a little chunky. I had the last name Lundberg, and so once people figured out how that rhymed with Hindenburg and they learned about the disaster, that was really rough for me. The humanity, one might say. But I had this elementary school teacher that saw those things and said, look, this is not just a bug, it's a feature. And turned me on to debate, and 30 years later of involvement in one way or another, it's something that I am completely passionate about. And like Dr. Baird, not only am I passionate about it, but the way that it links up with rhetoric. So I'm a rhetorician by trade. You know, like that puts you at a weird place in the university, as so many of us know. You have a beef with the philosophers who kicked us out a long time ago. Still call me Hindenburg, which is weird. And you know, the kind of essence of that dispute was a dispute over whether or not rhetoric and empty talk were the same. And you know, is rhetoric just substanceless words, or figuring out quick and devastating one-liners, or is it something more than that? And Dr. Baird didn't see it as simply manipulative technique. He said, rhetoric is the study of the words that make up us in our world, and that debate is a means of engaging that exchange of words that is structured and facilitates perspective taking. So the formalized practice of debate in some way is not an attempt to push the worst elements of rhetoric. It's an attempt to constrain it by creating the conditions by which people might not only formalize fighting, but ask the question in discourse, what kind of world do you want to build? And through what words will you build it together? You know, to riff on the ancient Platonic and Gorgias's encomium to Helen, rhetoric is both medicine, cure, and poison. Plato said it was a pharmacon, that it could be both things at the same time. And I think the question Dr. Baird is ultimately pursuing is, do you want your words to be a cure, or do you want them to be the poison? That's the kind of substance of some of the earliest texts in rhetoric, seeing that kind of ambivalent nature of its relationship with either making the city whole or causing it to fall apart. And it's the instinct that I think is like you can't read a couple pages of Dr. Baird's work without running into it directly. Like, for as much as people worry about debate as a means of formalizing fighting, the basic point that underlays so much of his work is that we're going to talk. We may even fight. And even when we're not fighting face to face, we all know that you're positioned in your head contrary to other people. And there's not a person in this room that does not think of a rebuttal when they hear something they don't agree with. And if that's the case, then look, it's better to formalize it than not to formalize it. It's better to open it up to scrutiny and engagement with other people. And the great thing about Baird's work is that Dr. Baird hardly ever pointed to the potential benefits of good training in debate or in rhetoric without pointing to the other side of the coin, that it too had the possibility of being something much, much worse. And so it's better for us instead to think about ways that we can produce a framework for debate or for talking that not only manages the potential risks to it, but optimizes the possibility for the good. Like, of course, words and argumentative wizardry can be distorted. Everybody knows that. And to study rhetoric is not to advance that. Instead, the question for someone like Baird is not whether debate or should we persuade, but rather what is the alternative to doing it? Because there's no meaningful way of getting to the possibility for truth without engaging other folks, without kind of having commerce in words. There's no way of making the truth do the thing we want it to do, despite all the possible problems with claiming a vision of the truth, that doesn't ask the question, how might we articulate it together in the way that makes the world more humane and more hopeful and helps us figure it out, and that persuades people, even if it be provisional, of the beauty and possible power of truth. So in one of his landmark texts, Public Discussion and Debate, Baird writes, "You who discuss know that the world has moved onward and upward more rapidly because of an army of talkers. The great ally, though, of truth is free and full discussion of matters upon which opinion differs. The student, therefore, who is learning in the classroom and on the platform the technique for an honest defense of right convictions and intelligent policies, is committed to a most practical and worthy task of advancing the truth." Now, look, unlike my promise, very little of that was about me, but I did want to point out, of course, debate has brought me to some cool places, but the whole point for Dr. Baird, I think, is yes, we might individually get something out of the process of participating in or training debate, but the core goal of it is to show us that there is a world of others, other ideas, other people, other perspectives. And what makes debate great, when you see beyond the spectacle of the fight, is that there's something much more important in it. The world is not about you. You can't make conforming the world to your own image your goal. And the point of good debate is not to oppose you to, but to draw you into the world and to be changed by others, to open up the possibility of change because you think and you feel and you contact them and what they believe and what matters to them. So having said that, debate was good for me, but it's good for you. One of the things I admire most about Dr. Baird's academic work is that thing I noted at the beginning, that it integrated all this stuff in philosophy and psychology and logic. And he particularly liked the place where psychology and logic intersected. It was a big Dewey thing at the time, but Baird was really good on it. And so much of Baird's work is woven into textbooks and to other guides for speaking. And as a textbook author, I can tell you, most people look at that and they say, well, that's the kind of bland work that doesn't really do anything besides walk through students through a couple of steps. But it's funny because if you the people who reflected on Dr. Baird and Dr. Baird's work, and even in his textbooks and his guides, you see consistently this emphasis on hard work and preparation and practice. And in fact, when people got together and talked about what Dr. Baird taught them, there's this big party for him where they put together what would be, I think, the last edited volume of Great American Speeches. And everyone said to a T that it's this commitment to hard work and preparation and intentional practice that was like the hallmark of Dr. Baird's teaching, pedagogy, et cetera. So, but what he'd do is he took that same commitment to kind of preparation and practice and he translated it into these guidebooks and textbooks about debate. So, for example, if you read it, at first you're like, wow, this is very detailed. But the beauty of the detail is he takes students from the first steps. Like, hearing about a topic and then brainstorming about it and then reflecting on their brainstorming and then setting a research agenda and then executing that agenda to translating it into a strategy and executing it in a debate. And like each step in this intricately detailed process has its own kind of beautiful scrutiny and attention and care. And if you were just to give it a cursory glance and throw it aside and be like, well, this is just another textbook, you might miss the whole point of writing a guide about going through the routine. Because if you read him more closely, he is actually writing in the most explicit terms possible about the intersection between philosophy or between psychology and logic. He's not doing it by giving you a concept or a definition. He's not doing it by starting from axiomatic beginnings and working through the implications. He's doing it by building into these textbooks this kind of beautiful example of how you might actually operationalize those modes of thinking. He is weaving into his kind of pedagogy and his attention to excruciating attention to detail in teaching people about debate, the basics of logic, its relationship to our own psychology and means of confirmation, and ultimately seeing debate as a way of kind of getting beyond or breaking out of that. So, think about how he thinks about a topic. He has this brilliant point in one of the guides for preparing debate, where he makes this, I think, profoundly important argument. Is one of those things that you're reading, you're like, oh wow, I'd never thought about that way before. But makes the claim that the most difficult opponent that you face in a debate is not the well-dressed people sitting across the room from you. The most difficult opponent that you face in a debate is yourself, your own pre-existing commitments to how you think about a topic and the kinds of biases that you have on it. And Baird's point is that to engage in this process of preparation and to rigorously kind of lay out the details of it is not simply about producing a better outcome in a debate. Baird's point is that that's about dealing with the own kind of confirmation bias and preconceptions that you have about the world. And in going through iterations of doing that and in approaching different topics, you may learn about one resolution or another. But the important thing is you've had a set of structured reps that allow you to think about the conditions of your own bias such that they may be meaningfully not only externalized, but open to scrutiny by others. Imagine what that means as a technology for thinking together. Those moments in his textbooks where he really walks through the process of thinking and expressing and anticipating hearing and being heard in return and exchanging and talking and thinking through arguments and preparing, starting from the very beginning and going towards the end. It's the one that interests me the most, because if we think about what critical thinking means these days, I don't know, it's, I guess, an argumentation person's basic lot in life is to think that critical thinking is just not accepting any preconceptions about anything and ruthlessly tearing down whatever it is that we might scrutinize. And Baird's point about critical thinking is a little more nuanced. Real critical thinking is seeing the roots of your own convictions, seeing the limits of your own perspective on something, recognizing that built into them is something that is useful for understanding the world, and simultaneously saying that you should start to assign to each of them a relative strength and think about whether they're justifiable through the context of research and debate. And in doing so, you have a reevaluation of your own understanding of the world that makes it more productive and more open to understanding where it might be changed, where it might be revised, and where your convictions might be, extended. He's giving students a framework in that pedagogical stuff for not only seeing all sides of a debate or an issue, but in generously engaging the best arguments on all those different sides and in taking them seriously such that people might come to the best conclusions themselves, and seeing the limits of your own conclusion and saying that the best conclusion can only come by externalizing those things, by making them subject to debate. And so that's the brilliance of his theory, I think. It doesn't move by talking from precept to implication. It moves by creating a practice and example. It's like chicken soup for the rhetorician's soul, the progymnasmata. You go through a series of exercises, and in doing, you're not simply memorizing a form, but you're learning a practice that is portable. And the thing that's beautiful about it, and Baird says this explicitly, is that it is a way of getting individuals the most out of collective thinking and the way of letting collective thinking get the most out of each individual. It's a technology for optimizing the communal and critical roots of reason. And so, I think he'd be interested. He was always interested in his contemporaries in psychology. I think were he theorizing, writing textbooks, and doing all that stuff today, I think he'd really like this emerging field of thought called the argumentative theory of reason. So it's this strand of thinking about cognition that's written by some very smart folks. And they're smart because it takes like 8 minutes to pronounce their discipline. So cognitive evolutionary neuroscience. And their basic shtick is this. We have lots of conventional answers for what makes human beings outcompete other species. And they're pretty predictable. Like if you ask your undergraduates, why are humans the dominant species? They'll usually say something like opposable thumbs, or we invented fire, or some kid in the back of class is going to say like capacity for existential reflection. But most of those explanations say ultimately your brain is a more efficient reasoning machine than the other animals out there, and so humans were smarter, they could use logic to solve problems. So these argumentative theory of reason folks, they say, yeah, but if you really think about it, you have this like massively giant, I'm not just complimenting you, massively giant and calorically demanding and neurally dense brain that is way out of line with the rest of the other animals. It consumes a ton of energy to make. Like as it's growing, it consumes a ton of energy to maintain. And so you have this giant complex thing on top of your head that's consuming all your energy. And if you think about how it came into existence, its evolutionary history, there had to be this like middle school awkward type time where you had a big brain that demanded a lot of calories, but you didn't yet have the capacity for fire or for complex problem solving or for logic or for existential contemplation. And if you imagine that period of time, for the human, there had to be this strange like disadvantage in our evolution where we had this energy demanding brain that took up a lot of space and that demanded a lot out of us, but we didn't have tools of the internet yet, so we should have been prey for everything that was out there. So they asked the question, what is it that created a survival value for the human and human cognition before the full benefits of the brain were realized? And, we're not endowed with, well, most of us are not endowed with super strong muscles. We don't have sharp fangs or fur that allows us to survive the winter alone. So they start theorizing the idea by thinking about humans as herd animals. So they think that the thing that gave us a survival advantage at that awkward point in time before existential reflection was not that we could do reasoning better or rational calculation or computational thinking, but because we were herd animals, the thing that creates survival value for us was that our brains allowed us to make very finely tuned distinctions between who was a member of our herd and who wasn't. So the secret of the brain's evolution and our unique facility for language, they say, is the thing that got the benefit out of that big brain and in turn grew it. Ultimately, human beings are really, really good at figuring out who's with us and who's against us. And if you're like so many of the folks in the room are, if you're, I don't know, like me, a middle-aged teacher of undergraduates, and you try and make a pop culture reference, you'll feel that immediately. Like you think you're being hip, and they're just like, who's this old guy talking about Justin Bieber? And who is Justin Bieber anyway? That capacity that allows us to hear the difference in how people talk, to make those fine-grained linguistic determinations is what drove the growth of the human brain, according to them. And it created survivability for us because it created more efficient herds. But there's this hiccup. Our hiccup is when we think about human cognition, we think about it as something that belongs to individuals, like my brain calculates X, Y, or Z. But on this view, argumentative theory of reason, cognition is essentially socially distributed. So the brain evolves as it does to allow us to think together with other people, and its fundamental function is to decide who's in our group and who's not, who's with us and who's against us. And so the point is that, like the Watson selection test, you all know this, they put cards on a table, you ask people how many cards they have to turn over to follow a rule. It turns out it's a very simple articulation of very basic conditional logic. It's the kind of thing that you should be able to do in a snap if you're a good computational thinker, and a massive amounts of even college-educated adults fail it. It turns out that human beings are really bad at formal reasoning in kind of symbolic terms. But if you take a problem and you put it in a social context and you ask the same question, we'll solve it like that. Cognition is distributed. It's tied to the function of language in a social context. All of a sudden, human beings are great at it. So we can't master formal logical reasoning, but it's very easy for us when you put it in a social context. Now, we've talked a lot about the idea of confirmation bias recently, and there's this great insight in the argumentative theory of reason that overlaps almost seamlessly with something Dr. Baird said. When we think together, and because the roots of our thinking are in thinking together, groupthink is both a bug and a feature. So it's a bug in that your brain is optimized for screening out evidence that you don't agree with. We tend to affirm the conventional wisdom. We all get into all kinds of bad decisions. But it's a feature too. It's a feature too because when we think well together, in those rare times where we collectively get it right, the reasons why we do it are intimately tied to leveraging what is already built into our experience and using it as a means of validating knowledge because it is affirmed and circulated by a group. That's the key reason why thinking in context is so important. You can be smart on your own. You can be even smarter if you think critically about yourself and test your own ideas against reality or whatever, even though it might be uncomfortable. But the smartest is being critical and being with others. Thinking together, as long as you don't let groupthink get in the way, realizing some formalized process of collective reflection is the best that human beings will ever be at thinking. You need a structured process, though, to make it work. God forbid you'd want to, I don't know, structured process it back and forth where interlocutors would present evidence and then create the possibility for scrutiny from other people. If there's some magic technology that allows us to do this, it might optimize the way we think. I think about that in the context of the quote that I read from Dr. Baird towards the very beginning. Whole smooth talker, army smooth talkers thing. The whole idea turns on this idea that we need the capacity to simultaneously optimize our own ability to think and be critical, but do it in a context that is bounded by a group and that has some community guardrails for discussion and for thinking. Or, as Dr. Baird would call it, debate. Debate. And, debate makes you smarter. And it's not just the content of what you're learning about that matters. People are going to learn all kinds of strange and trivial things in debate, but it's the process that matters. And by the way, we can't decide in advance what's strange or trivial until we've actually gone through the process of thinking about it. And in a world where you're an animal that is either shackled or turbocharged by distributed cognition, it makes all of you and all of us better and smarter to learn to think well together. All right, 3, all of us. Will human-driven climate change end us? Will tariffs make America great again? Are vaccines safe? Was the 2020 election stolen? Is America racist? Are we too woke? Not woke enough? What is woke? Is democracy doomed? What is happening? Though we might prefer to avoid these questions, we have to answer them somehow. The question is not if we will collectively argue about these things. We can't not argue about them because folks disagree. And we can't avoid meaningful disagreement because I guess we could run from it and end up in a society that's even more polar than it is now. Or we could run into the arguments like proverbial bulls in a china shop without any guardrails and see what happens. And weirdly, different segments of America are kind of doing both right now. And at least where I sit, I don't know about you, but where I sit, it's not going very well. So we might take a hint from Dr. Baird about learning to argue together. Even the mention of the word, though, is sometimes what they say these days, problematic. The idea of argument conjures scenes of heated exchange, raised voices, desperate urge to find an exit. Arguments, at least as we understand it, are the cause and the symptom of our collective friction and political bind. So more arguing would only add fuel to the fire. I've heard it a million times from university administrators. And if more people entered the fray with more skill and greater innovation, it would amplify the chaos. So usually we settle this argument over argument in a totally predictable manner. We're like, look, be nice to one another. If you can't come to some point of agreement, agree to disagree. And after all, your opinion, it's your possession. So if someone is trying to take it away from you or criticize it, just walk away and go different ways amicably. Side note, I do not understand agreeing to disagree. Like the core basis of democracy as first theorized was the idea that it was disagreement that served as the means of coming to some kind of forged agreement. And in fact, the founding, one of the principles upon which America is founded, important enough to be on our money, e pluribus unum, out of many one, and not just many different people, but it's a celebration of the many provisional unities possible in the interaction of different perspectives, ideas, or arguments. We were talking about at dinner last night, an epistemic pluralism as opposed to simply a demographic one. All of that, agreeing to disagree, has been a disaster. All it did is create more segmented communities that were more intensely committed to their own beliefs and more skeptical about others, and America feels stuck. So I want to break down stuckness for a second. With all this talk about radical polarization, decline of empathy, collapse of morals, the kids just don't care these days, media is segmenting us, big money in politics, whatever your diagnosis is of America's current political bind, stuckness, that condition of stuckness leaves us with very basic choices. I'm a simple Utah kid, so I've got simple choices. One, retreat from public discourse. It's a mess, we're done with it. Two, double down and repeat the partisan script that you already know, or try and, I guess, get conversation moving forward again somehow. We know from the data that there is a small segment of Americans that have become more politically active. So, that means they're voting more than they used to, doing conventionally political things. They're also, excuse my French, blank posting, tweeting, picking political fights at family functions. And perhaps in response to that, larger numbers of Americans have opted to withdraw. So they've stopped talking, the data tells us, stop talking about politics with their friends or people close to them. 6 in 10 Americans report staying silent to avoid conflict. 3 in 4 report the experience of censoring themselves. And that's the weird thing about the kind of terms of America's ongoing democratic argument. The vast majority of the data say are opting out, while a small minority of people are opting in more intensely, retreat or repeat. And though neither intends it, together, you can't imagine a better way of totally shattering democracy and ruining the most basic process through which democracies come to a shared understanding of fact. The theorists of democracy, all the folks that are talking about free expression these days, they are there's intrinsic hope in the idea that people will come together and exchange ideas, and we just have to let that exchange happen without really thinking about the best ways for training people for it. And that's beautiful in principle, but in practice, a public that is not equipped to engage argument in a meaningful way, where some people a smaller group of people is getting increasingly loud and the rest of us are kind of giving up, what happens? Those that remain in and repeat the script, they double down, don't revise their political commitments. Instead, they kind of consistently replay these scripts that make them comfortable, and they increasingly apply them to more and more areas, which is the fascinating thing about American political discourse, that it has in some ways become totally agnostic about the character of any individual issue, and instead says, what is the opinion of the party on this thing? And people will retroactively change principles that they are committed to. It's so weird. But also we know that the people who double down, the data say they become more emotionally polarized. So when you ask them, how do you feel about people on the other side, they're madder. They have a higher visceral dislike or animosity towards people on the other side. But these are the people that are being more invested in politics. So for a segment of the population, higher political investment, more polarization, more explicitly defining their politics in divisive, even antagonistic terms. And then, the larger section of America says that they are exhausted by politics, that they're done with it. 87% of Americans say they're exhausted with division. 88% believe that polarization is a threat to our future. And, commentators have this silly debate. Is it worse for us to retreat, or is it worse for us to repeat, to invest or to back off, to become more polar and partisan and intensely invested in what we say, or for people to disconnect? And the problem is both are happening at the same time. Our politics is defined by a super political minority and an exhausted majority. And together, the repeaters and the retreaters create a public sphere in which all of the basic preconditions that would have made democracy work just can't. The cumulative conjoint effect of retreating and repeating at the same time has dire implications for democratic argument. The motives for resolving conflict become weaker because we have less connection to other people. Our already tenuous sense of common identity starts to recede. And so what binds people to the political process becomes more frayed. The argument forms that we use in everyday political discourse become more charged. It becomes more difficult to come to any agreement about anything. The one thing we know is that more and more Americans agree that we just can't agree on the basic facts anymore. But more deeply, the democratic process does require a little bit of faith in participation, creating some good or some outcome. So in the context of joint repeat and retreat, our collective citizen, our future as citizens together, who, all things being equal, think that it's better to be smarter together than not, we're really at a point where there are hazards in utterly eroding not only the sense of political unity or identity, but even the possibility that democracy can earn facts through the process of arguing. That's scary. That there's no means for creating the possibility for some sense of even contingent truth that frames the conditions of our disagreements in interest or perspective or position. So retreat and repeat together risk what is, I think, even more than better political decision-making, the most valuable intersection of democracy and knowledge. I've got a book for that. I'm working with my friend Andy Perrin at Johns Hopkins. And the thing that we're awfully concerned about in the book is that hopefully the institutions that make democracy work remain intact. But we are also facing a condition where it's possible that all the formal and institutional grounds for democracy can exist, and yet America will not remain meaningfully a democracy if the point of democracy is for us to forge the possibility of consensus together. In fact, I love this, hopefully it's catchy enough, we think that America is no longer a democracy, but an antagonocracy, a context where the political incentives for sustaining and creating disagreement are higher than the ones than coming to any point of consensus. And you see it reflected in our politics consistently. I mean, think about it. Like everyone's like, I don't know, people are giving up on moderates. They're shifting to a base politics, which is about motivating people. That all the things that would have created incentives for us to work together and to have difference, although it's painful as a means of driving democracy forward, instead, we're starting to reach a point where the incentives to resolve arguments are outweighed by the incentives to relish them. Forgive me if it's too soon, but it might shut down democracy. See? Yeah, very clever. So antagonocracy reverses the typical relationship between democracy and difference. So no claim is a priori of fact. There's nothing that we could establish to fight over. The facts in a democracy are established by a process of deliberation and debate that is in some way subtended to by our faith in the process. In a democracy, facts aren't given. They're kind of like earned. We earn them together. And as that sense of earned fact together diminishes, at least the point of the book is we start to increasingly rely on what we call superfacts. That is shortcuts whose point is to justify an argument to people on your side while utterly eluding debate from the other side. So a superfact is an argumentative shortcut that makes up for the loss of earned democratic fact. We'll talk a little bit about it in Q&A if you want, but I want to make it all about the superfact. I want to make the point that as we shortcut more and more into scripts that we are more and more invested in and that are less vulnerable to scrutiny by other people, democracy is in fairly rough shape. And, you know, I'd make the point, but I think Dr. Baird made the point way better than I ever could have made it. In principle and in practice, if students don't learn to argue here in the context of a university, if we can't have a reasoned discussion about, say, reproductive or civil rights in a managed context where there is a mediator and other people who have access to similar information, if we can't have that argument here, how do we expect anyone to go out into the wild and have that argument in any way that is meaningful? And if we're not cultivating the capacities to do that here, why are we surprised when we get a public which is increasingly fractured, increasingly averse to fact, and increasingly averse to listening to other people? And if not here, where? If not in a debate, how? It is time for universities to return to the task of teaching people to argue, not as a side effect of focusing on some other content, not as something that just randomly pops up in the curriculum or that gets added on as a workshop, but as a primary point of pedagogical emphasis. Dr. Baird put it better than me. Quote, "It is sometimes charged that argument creates an atmosphere of futile strife. This objection assumes that debate exists merely to gratify the pugnacious instinct. As a matter of fact, we argue not only because we want to discover truth, but because we want to make truth prevail." Only thus can society make progress. Debate and argument clear the atmosphere for us and hasten progress. Thanks. Questions, thoughts, objections, discussion of any kind? What? Oh, maybe discussions. No.
Wait, is this? I'm gonna go ahead and ask the first
Oh,
question.
sure.
And then I'll happily pass
I'm
the
gonna sit if
microphone
that's
on.
okay. I got
That's totally okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming and visiting with us.
Thank you.
I think that was an excellent talk to remind us of how debate comes to shape the capacities that we all, I think, know are really important in terms of what we ask our undergraduates to take away. And I suppose my question for you is, when thinking about kind of the scale of the problems that you identified, right? We're talking about social structures undergoing immense transformation for how we come to think about fact. The solution that you seem to locate in terms of a trained capacity for students seems to be at a different scale than that. And so I guess I'm curious, how do we connect, say, the work that we do training undergraduates to kind of those big elements of,
Yeah.
call it civil or social culture, that are simply greater than kind of the work we
Yeah.
can access in the classroom?
Yeah. You know, I lean more conservative than many of my friends on many things, but there's this part of me that just can't get enough of John Dewey. And, you know, when John Dewey thinks about dealing with these larger structural problems that, seem so difficult and so separated from the very quotidian things that we might do in a university classroom, he makes this point that one of our mistakes in diagnosing social problems is that when we see structures, we see them simply as natural, pre-existent institutional forces that are in no meaningful way related to human habit and practice. And he makes this point, just like Foucault does and so many other good people in kind of critical traditions, that we can never give in to the idea that structures are determined in advance in a way that is outside of the realm of human desires and habits and practices. And so, you know, when Dewey diagnoses, he says, you know, there's often not a quick fix to any one of those problems. And, you know, we're probably in for some difficult pain, if I say it in a hopeful way, as we reconstruct our democracy. But there's just not another real good shot, is the point that Baird makes and Dewey makes. And so the question is, you know, we need something that changes our culture of argument. I think it's the case that there are very few mechanistic reforms to our politics that can address the underlying problem absent that. And that is a long and grinding task, which to my mind just requires hiring more argument people at more universities and making it a universal requirement in the curriculum. Next question. No, yeah, I know it's hard, right? Because, I mean, Dewey talks a lot about it in terms of a kind of commitment to democratic hope. And that, there's this great old theological distinction between in the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism sees the inevitability that things will get better if we put our mind to it. Hope realizes that there's not a direct connection between our effort and the outcome, but the best shot that we have is to believe that something different might be possible.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And then as a teacher of undergrad students at a Purple State, this is a real pressing question, what you have shared with us. So it is particularly related to your notion of critical thinking as seeing the roots of your conviction, but it is also related to my own question as a teacher. So, you know, people are not interested and they are very anxious whenever they are given a question that has both sides, and then students want to avoid that. And then I asked whether to my undergrads, whether they think that they are capable of persuading the others. And then typically half of them are optimistic but when I asked the question whether it is possible, whether they think that they can be persuaded by the others, it's always zero. And then, and then students are also shocked. What's the point of thinking about persuasion and debate and argumentation? And then that's where the conversation becomes interesting. But I started thinking about this. It is also related to the way that we talk about debate or communication, like initiating a conversation, empowering students so that they can talk and then engage. But in a lot of ways, this debate or communication also presumes that winning over or persuading or converting someone
Yeah.
is the inevitable process, and they are very afraid that they might be converted
Yeah.
or persuaded. So undergrad's curriculum talks a lot about empowerment and then engaging in conversation.
Yeah.
But have you thought about? No, I'm just like thinking out loud
Yeah,
based
yeah.
on your critical thinking. Do you think that there are ways through which we can make them more
Yeah.
vulnerable?
Yeah.
Without the idea of losing the battle or
Yeah.
being converted.
Okay, so I love the question, and it's actually something debate pedagogy thinks a lot about. And it's one of the things that makes the discussion difficult at universities, because when we imagine debate, we imagine you're going to stand on your side and say what you believe in, and we're going to pick out a student who thinks something different, and you're just going to have it out. And like we are basically foregrounding the identity threat of every communicative process at every instance that we can at university. So we're going to have an intervention where a speaker is going to come and talk to you today about the presence of different biases that you may not realize that you have. And you're going to listen to that speaker. And because you get the conceptual edifice behind what they're saying right, you'll be magically transformed. So weirdly enough, there's this really difficult persuasive problem, exactly the one that you pointed out, that we foreground that there's an identity threat. We foreground that the student probably has something within them that they need to change. And we say, hey, we're just going to put you through this very comfortable procedure. It's like pulling a tooth. It'll hurt a little bit. You'll feel much better in the end. And the brilliance of debate pedagogy, and there's great data on this too, but Baird saw it better than anybody. Baird has this section right before the one that I read at the very beginning, where he does this really strange thing. He's like, should you learn to argue? Well, look, someday your life may depend on it in one way or another. Someday you may have to convince someone of something that the stakes are everything on it. You may have to, essentially, it's like you may have to debate one way or the other to survive. And then he's like, but, just think, this is a fun competition. You're going to learn some things, and then kind of talks about the techniques for doing it. And I think one of the great virtues of debate as practiced in the intercollegiate setting and in a competitive setting is that, and I do this in class too, you start students with, look, you don't have to change any opinion that you have. This is in no way related to anything that you meaningfully believe about anything, but let's play a game. And the game is, I'm going to be totally agnostic towards what you believe about something, and every person in this class will have to speak by necessity, sometimes against what they believe and sometimes for what they believe. But don't hold that against anybody. They're just doing the assignment, and the competition's fun, and you're just trying to prove that you can play the game. And, in the end, because we all have the permission to talk about something that we don't necessarily believe in, we're just going to treat this as a little experiment where you kick around inside another idea, and you're probably right. So your idea will probably come out stronger. And relieving that identity threat, I think, makes it a lot easier for people to learn the capacity to look at and reflect on their own roots. And if they don't do that directly, they at least learn the argumentative infrastructure that says, identify something, see what warrants it, and just kind of ask yourself some questions about whether or not there may be a better alternative. So there's two fields, I'll stop yammering about this, but there's two kind of methodologies for debate studies that folks have done. And one is, does debate change things? And what they typically mean is, if you get two speakers in a room and they're fighting with each other over things that they agree on, and there are people in the audience, people almost always come away more committed to their initial belief after watching an exchange like that. If you have people participate, if you relieve them of the duty to represent their own opinion and you tell them they're experimenting, you let them switch a number of times and you create a competitive social incentive for doing the procedure, funnily enough, people will engage in the basic capacities that might allow them to reflect on the roots of their convictions without seeing their convictions being at stake. And the studies that look at this kind of switch side methodology where you also have people in, so I have all the rest of my students judge the other kids debating, that engage in that kind of methodology where you're beholden to a third party, you're not necessarily representing yourself, and you're experimenting with ideas by talking on both sides. And those students come out more revisable than they were before. Not on whatever the topic they were debating about is, but in general, because it starts to habituate this kind of process of, oh, well, I can at least hold an idea up and ask how it's justified. So I agree with you, like, but the thing, I do think universities make it way, way, way worse because we say, look, everything about your reputation in person hinges on you listening to this training because you've got some significant problem in how you think that is making the world a lot worse. So just listen to this. And funnily enough, students are like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. But if you allow people to suspend their relationship to that a little bit so that you can kind of basically by inception create that capacity, I don't know that it always works, but it's a better shot than we have currently. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, are there other strategies you thought about to try and get students to do the really difficult thing of looking at their own deep convictions?
Well, I was particularly thinking about my globalization and culture because students are so afraid to have any conversation about Israel, Palestine, or neocolonialism. And then I think like theories sometimes open their eyes.
Yeah, sure.
So there was one theory where the author argues that the major fault line is not between civilizations, but the discrepancy between cities and then rural areas. And then I think that made a lot of like Trump-leaning Iowa farm kids
They identified
see
with
their
Yep.
see their problems through a different language.
Yeah.
So, but I can do only as much in one semester. And then now I'm wondering about the like bifurcation. And then what did you say? Antagonocracy? So maybe start with K through 12?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, I think that like that, I mean, I don't know, it would be great, I think, to have critical argumentative capacities integrated earlier in the curriculum that were not just about evaluation of evidence. Like typically, I love media studies and media theory, and like I think about that moment when all the awesome things that media folks in that tradition said about the relationship between medium and message got boiled down to media literacy. Here's 6 questions to ask about something that you read online. And so I do think that there's this awesome role for theory that is far enough away from a person that they can think a problem differently. And then and in fact, the old Greek office there, theoros was a diplomatic position for the Greeks. It meant that if there was some other big event in another city, you'd send a representative from your city to go witness it. And then that person would come back to your city. That was the root of theory. And the weird thing is, the Greeks thought about it as the theoros is changed by the journey so they can bring back a different experience to us. It wasn't about reporting, it was about the journey back. And as a person who loves theory, like I think theory can do that. You see the world in a way that is far enough away from your own vocabulary for your core convictions that you can then somehow return to your context and see it differently. That's a great methodology. And it's a real possibility, as is, I think story can do a very similar thing. Like I encounter someone else where I have a point of identification with someone who would typically be posed against me, and the story opened my mind and yada, yada. Those are great. Those are the 2 cards we have in our deck in the academy. And they will work sometimes and they won't work other times. And I think it's good to just supplement it with, it is weird. Like I talk to so many of my colleagues and they're so kind of seized up about the possibility that conflict could break out in the classroom at any time. And they don't see that in some ways it's a result of going in and saying, your hegemonically constituted worldview has made you into an automaton of the machine. And like, figuring out ways that are on the same line and of the same spirit as learning by theory or learning by connection in a story or empathizing with something. I think Dr. Baird was just arguing for the argumentative version of that, which is I take up something that is not at the core of my identity convictions to enter it into an exchange with other people at first because there are competitive and social game playing type incentives based in it. But then there are moments where that experience of being a little bit different from yourself changes you. But I agree with the thrust of the question too. Like ultimately, how do we change antagonocracy? We'd have to get people to find some degree of distance from their core convictions in a way that they can hold them up. Yeah.
I wish I can't get out of my classroom.
Right? Well, that's the alternative because students withdraw too, right? They're like, I don't want to talk about it. So they withdraw from real public discourse around things.
Do we have any additional questions that we want to offer to Dr. Oh, yes.
Oh, I'm in trouble now. It's coming.
Oh, I love this.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was very interesting. I am both fascinated and terrified by this concept of the superfact that
Mhm.
you've articulated. And if I'm understanding the concept correctly, I think I see it all the time with my undergrads in the philosophy classroom. And so my question is, how can we as moderators in the conversation intervene when we see
Yeah.
the reliance on superfacts? And then maybe a secondary question of how can we make sure that we ourselves are not relying on superfacts when we're conveying information?
Oh, those are awesome questions. The example we talked about a version of this earlier. Like my favorite example of a superfact is misinformation. So, President Obama gave this address at Stanford where he's like, misinformation is the biggest threat to democracy. And I happen to agree to an extent. But what's funny about it is, so soon after President Biden created this Office of Misinformation. And the idea was to monitor the media, to figure out those times where something that was reported was not connected to reality. And what was interesting is then immediately conservative commentators were like, okay, so you've created an office of truth essentially and made all these references to, Orwell and that tradition, and you're misinformed about the problem of conservative media misrepresenting things. And the funniest part was the office responded to those attacks by conservatives by saying, well, the conservative attack is misinformed. Right? So the interesting thing about a superfact is it is a script that defers the real question. So the real question initially, I think, is like, should the government have a role in moderating what counts as true? And the conservative argument to the contrary is reasonable. It's not certain that it was playing out in this instant. But as soon as folks had the idea of misinformation as the container for the larger argument that avoided the real question, debate just spun off into whatever. And we see it in all kinds of realms of debate. So how do you get students to see it? I mean, in part, it might be labeling it and just identifying it and what it's doing. But I think, to your point, like just defining it doesn't get far enough. So I think as a teacher, the biggest thing to do is to take a pause and return people back to the question that's being elided by the superfact. So are the conservatives really concerned in their critique of the liberal office about the information status of the claims on either side? Tell me about that. And like, in the end, neither side is really particularly interested in the information content because politics is basically beating that out of us. And getting people to see the element of real criticism that is built into the idea of information without reducing it to the script. And so that's a moment where opening up reflection and just taking a pause and getting people to fill in what's behind the claim is a helpful way of revealing the operation of the superfact. And like for ourselves, that's the weird thing is like, why do we engage in argument by superfacts? Because there's no other available vocabulary for us to translate to other people a point that aligns us with them because the in-group scrutiny has also gotten so high. So if you're on the left, like people are worried about small deviations that mark you out of the group. And if you're on the right, people are like, oh, you're being kind of a liberal here. And so the environment that produces the possibility of the superfact is one in which groups have kind of essentially turbocharged their internal differentiation machine so that there's no room for difference. And that's why more and more of these practices that suspend the consequence of violating the group norm and the consequence of identity loss while creating a safe guardrail for discussion, the more of that I think that we have in classes, the easier it is to see the places where people are making a super fact-oriented argument. But other than that, all you can do, like any process of learning, is pause and get people to reflect on the preconditions and pause and get people to reflect on the preconditions. It's time. Is it time? It's time.
First of all, let us thank Dr. Christian Lundberg for an excellent talk. And then second, I wanted to point out that we are joined by a very special audience member, which is Barbara Baird Reese, who is A. Craig Baird's only child. So thank you that you joined us, Barbara. Okay. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and safe travels home.